Unbelievable case with the most shocking twist you'll ever. Hook. Imagine you're caught in a nightmare, but no matter how hard you try, you can't wake up. What if everything you've ever known, every piece of your reality, was a lie? This case will blow your mind, and the twist? It will leave you questioning everything. Stay till the end, you won't believe what happens next. The office was dim. Shadows stretched across the walls. It was late. Too late. The clock ticked louder with every passing second. But it wasn't the ticking that made the hairs on the back of his neck rise. It was the feeling. The feeling of being watched. Jake shuffled through the files, his eyes scanning, darting. Something wasn't right. The room was still. Too still. He stopped. His fingers lingered on the edge of a folder. A thick, dark folder. He had never seen it before. The label read, Case 1987. That wasn't on his desk. Not in his cases. A chill ran through him. His breath came out in short bursts. But he couldn't stop himself. He opened it. The first photo was grainy, black and white. A woman, standing in front of a crumbling house. Her eyes empty. Hollow. Then the next photo. A man bound, gagged, his eyes wide in terror. His mouth twisted in silent scream. Jake's heart skipped a beat. That man. He recognized him. The name came to him like a punch to the gut. His old partner. Detective Lewis. But Lewis had disappeared 5 years ago. Vanished without a trace. Jake had thought he was dead. He flipped through more pictures. More photos of the same man. Tied up. In different locations. The last photo. Jake's blood ran cold. It was a picture of himself. Sitting at his desk. Taken from behind. Through the window. He slammed the folder shut. The room was too quiet now. His phone buzzed. A message. Don't trust anyone. It was from an unknown number. Jake's stomach twisted. He ran to the window. The street below was empty. But then, a shadow crossed the pavement. A figure standing still. Jake's heart raced. Was it him? Was it Lewis? The figure moved closer to the building. And stopped. Right beneath the window. Jake froze. His breath caught in his throat. Then, a knock at the door. Slow. Soft. His pulse thundered in his ears. Jake's eyes shot to the door. The knock came again. Faint, but deliberate. He couldn't move. The room felt like it was closing in on him. His hand hovered over the drawer, where his gun lay. But he wasn't sure he could reach it in time. Another knock. Longer this time. Jake forced himself to stand. His legs trembled. He stepped toward the door, his breath shallow. His fingers brushed against the cold metal of the handle. The world outside seemed to disappear. Just the door. And the sound of his own heartbeat. He swung it open. Nobody was there. The hallway stretched in both directions, empty. Nothing. A rush of relief washed over him. But then he noticed something. A small, white envelope was on the floor. No name. No markings. Just the envelope. Jake bent down slowly, picking it up. The paper felt cold to the touch. He opened it with shaking hands. Inside, there was a single sheet of paper. It was handwritten. Trust no one, Jake. You've been watched for years. His blood turned to ice. He stumbled back into the office. The door slammed behind him. He read the message again. And again. Years. The words echoed in his mind. He glanced back at the window. The figure was gone. But Jake knew. It wasn't over. His phone buzzed again. This time, it was an image. He opened it with trembling fingers. A photo of him. Sitting at his desk. From behind. The exact same shot. But this time, it was newer. The background wasn't from his office. It was from the alley outside. His heart stopped. The figure had been there all along. Jake's hands trembled as he stared at the photo. The alley. The one outside his building. But how could they have gotten the shot? He rushed to the window again, frantically pulling the blinds up. Nothing. The street was still empty. No shadow, no movement. He couldn't breathe. He had to think. Where was the person watching him? The phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't a photo. It was a video. His stomach churned. Jake hit play. The screen flickered for a second. Then the video started. It was grainy at first. A shaky, dark frame. Then, the camera steadied. And Jake saw himself. But it wasn't him in the office. It was him, in the alley. The camera was angled from a rooftop. And it zoomed in on him, standing still. His breath fogging the cold night air. Jake felt his stomach drop. This was weeks ago. The night he'd been walking home. The video continued. He saw himself stop in the middle of the alley, looking around. Eyes darting. Unsure. Then, the camera zoomed out. And there, standing across the street, was the figure. It was Louis. Jake's mind reeled. Impossible. Louis had disappeared. He couldn't breathe. Couldn't think. The video ended abruptly. And the phone buzzed again. Another message. It's too late. They're already here. The blood drained from Jake's face. The door. The hallway. Was someone coming for him now? The building was eerily quiet. Too quiet. Jake moved to the door. He couldn't wait any longer. He turned the lock slowly. Took a deep breath. And opened it. Nothing. Not a sound. He stepped out into the hallway. His footsteps echoed in the silence. Every corner felt like it was hiding something. Or someone. Then a door at the far end of the hall creaked open. A faint light spilling out. Jake's heart hammered. He wasn't alone. The door opened wider. He froze. The figure stepped into view. It was Louis. But there was something wrong. His eyes were empty. Like the photos. No recognition. Just a hollow stare. Jake's mouth went dry. Louis's lips parted. And he spoke. You're not going to make it out of here alive. Jake's breath caught in his throat. Louis' voice sounded strange, hollow. Like an echo from a nightmare. The words hung in the air, heavy and final. You're not going to make it out of here alive. Jake's mind spun. This wasn't the partner he had known. This was something else. The silence between them stretched, unbearable. Louis took a step forward. His eyes never leaving Jake's face. Jake instinctively took a step back. But the hallway seemed to stretch further. The walls closing in. Where had the room gone? The office, the window, the world outside. It all felt miles away. Who are you? Jake's voice cracked. Louis' lips curled into something like a grin. But it was cold. Dead. A sudden noise, a creak. A sound from behind. Jake spun around, but the hallway was still empty. The door. The one behind him. It was slowly closing. No one was there. His pulse surged. His heart was racing too fast. Louis took another step. Closer. You should have left it alone, he said. His voice barely a whisper now. Jake's eyes darted. His mind racing. Something wasn't right. This was more than just a missing person. This was planned. A trap. Jake's instincts kicked in. He reached for his gun. But it wasn't there. The drawer. The gun. It was gone. His breath hitched. The footsteps. The heavy steps behind him. Turning around. Jake saw the shadow first. A tall figure in the doorway. The door was fully open now. Another man. A woman stepped into view. Then another. They were surrounding him. The air was thick with tension. A dozen faces. None of them human. Jake's skin crawled. These weren't just people. They were hunters. You should have listened, the woman said. Her voice soft, like silk. Jake was trapped. There was no way out. His pulse hammered in his ears. And the hallway, the walls, they were closing in on him. Jake's body froze. The room seemed to collapse around him. The walls closing in with every breath he took. The figures surrounded him, tightening their circle. The woman's eyes gleamed with something dark. Something hungry. "Who are you?" Jake managed to choke out. His voice sounded distant. The man behind him chuckled. A low, guttural sound. The kind that made his spine go rigid. "You really don't know, do you?" the woman said, her lips curling into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Jake's mind raced. The figures. The photos. Louis. He had seen them before. He had known them. But the memory. It felt like it was slipping through his fingers. They had always been there. Watching. They were never gone. The woman stepped forward, her eyes never leaving his. "You were always a part of this," she whispered. Jake's stomach twisted. What did she mean? A sudden flash. A memory broke through the haze. The alley? That night. The figures lurking in the shadows. He had seen them, but hadn't understood. They were the ones who had been watching him, pulling the strings. And now they were here. Another step closer. The air grew colder. He could barely breathe. "Tell me who you are!" Jake shouted, his voice raw, desperate. The woman's smile widened. "Who are we?" she repeated. "Who are we?" Her laughter echoed in the narrow hallway. It wasn't human. Jake's head spun. The memories rushed back. All at once. Fragments, pieces. The files, the photos, the messages. He had been a part of their plan all along. He had never been a detective. He had never been a partner. He was their experiment. A pawn. A puppet in a twisted game. And now they were closing in. No escape. No one to help him. No way out. The figures stepped closer. One by one. Jake's legs trembled. He backed into the wall. And then, everything went dark. The last thing he heard was the woman's voice, whispering in his ear. "You're ours now." Jake's world was swallowed by darkness. The coldness of the walls pressed against his back. His body went numb. A distant, rhythmic thumping in his ears. Was it his heart? Or something else? A flicker of light. A brief moment of clarity. His eyes opened, though they felt heavy. He was no longer in the hallway. No longer in the office. He was lying on the floor. Concrete beneath him. A single light hung above, flickering. The shadows shifted in strange patterns. Twisting. Morphing. The air smelled stale, metallic. Jake tried to sit up. But his limbs were slow, unresponsive. The panic, like a tight knot in his chest, made it hard to breathe. He blinked, his vision clearing slowly. He was in some kind of room. A basement, perhaps? Cold stone walls. A heavy, rusted door at the far end. And standing in front of him, silent and still, was the woman. Her eyes glinted in the dim light. A predatory shine. Jake's breath hitched. His mouth dry. He couldn't speak. "Feeling a bit disoriented?" she asked. Her voice like silk, smooth and calculating. He managed to nod. His throat tight. She crouched down in front of him. Her face too close, too cold. "You think you were just a detective? A man who stumbled upon something bigger than himself." Jake's mind reeled. She was right. He had always felt like an outsider in this case. Never fully understanding. Always a step behind. "But," she continued, "you were always meant to find the truth." Jake blinked, his vision swimming again. His pulse quickened. What was she saying? She stood up slowly. The shadows seemed to follow her, twisting and curling around her form. "You were meant to join us. To be part of our experiment." Her smile widened. It was the kind of smile that chilled the bones. Jake struggled to speak, his voice barely a whisper. "Why me?" Her laughter filled the room. It was cold, calculated, Why not you? A movement caught his eye. In the far corner of the room, a figure stepped out of the shadows. Jake's heart stopped. It was Louis. But this time, something was different. His eyes were empty. Hollow. He didn't look human. He didn't look real. Isn't it beautiful? The woman said. Her voice softer now. You've been part of the game for years, Jake. A piece of the puzzle. Jake's mind raced. The twisted images. The messages. The figures that had been watching him. It was all part of this. Part of them. They had been guiding him. Leading him. He wasn't just a detective. He wasn't just trying to solve a case. He was the experiment. The puzzle. And the final piece was about to fall into place. Jake's heart hammered in his chest. His throat tight with fear. The room spun around him. The walls seemed to close in even further. Louis stepped forward. His movements stiff, unnatural. His eyes never blinking. Never showing any sign of recognition. Jake tried to scramble to his feet. But his body betrayed him. His legs felt like lead. Heavy and unresponsive. The woman watched him. Silent and still. As if waiting for something. Do you know why you're here? She asked. Her voice low and soothing. Why this has happened to you? Jake's breath caught. His mind fought against the fog that clouded his thoughts. He had been in this situation before. Hadn't he? This wasn't new. He had seen Louis before. In the photos. On the video. But something about this felt wrong. So wrong. Louis's eyes glowed now. Like the reflection of fire on water. Empty, but filled with something dark. Jake's pulse quickened. The woman knelt beside him. Her face inches from his. Don't you remember? Jake shook his head. His mind racing to piece it together. His hands shook uncontrollably. Think, she coaxed. You've been part of something bigger than you ever realized. This game isn't over. Her hand touched his shoulder. Cold. A sharp jolt of ice surged through him. You weren't meant to solve it, Jake. Her lips curled into a smile that sent a shiver down his spine. You were meant to be tested. The world blurred as his vision flickered. The room was shifting. The walls seemed to breathe. The floor beneath him pulsating. The air was thick, heavy with something dark. Suddenly, the lights flickered out. Darkness. For a split second, Jake thought he was blind. The panic rose in his chest. But then... a scream. It wasn't his. The sound echoed in the room. A high-pitched, guttural shriek that twisted the air. Jake turned his head sharply. Behind him, in the corner of the room, a figure writhed in the shadows. A man or something else. Jake couldn't tell. The figure twisted and jerked. Unnatural movements, like a broken marionette. And then it stopped. A heavy silence fell over the room. Jake's eyes locked with the woman's. She didn't flinch. Didn't seem fazed. This is the part where you start to realize, she whispered. Her voice soft but piercing. That there is no escape. There was never a way out. Jake's breath came in short gasps. His pulse pounding in his ears. He wanted to scream. To run. But his body wouldn't move. It was as if the very air had paralyzed him. His limbs frozen in place. Then, the figure in the corner began to move again. But this time, it wasn't alone. More figures emerged from the shadows. Some were humanoid. Others distorted. Unnatural. Jake's eyes widened in horror. They were the ones he had seen in the photos. In the messages. The ones watching him. And now they were all here. The woman stood. Her gaze fixed on Jake. As the figures closed in. You were never meant to survive this, Jake, she said softly. Her eyes glowing with an eerie light. Welcome to your end. The room went black. Jake's entire body went cold. The darkness was suffocating. He could feel the presence of the figures surrounding him. Their breath heavy in the air. their eyes fixed on him. He heard the shuffle of footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Then, a whisper. A breath against his ear. "Run, Jake!" His mind snapped. That voice, it wasn't the woman. It was Lewis. Jake's body jerked. But still he couldn't move. His legs felt like stone. The whisper came again. "Run! Now!" This time, Jake fought it. Fought the paralysis that had him locked in place. His body screamed in protest. But somehow, he managed to stagger to his feet. His vision blurred. His head spinning. The room was alive with movement. The figures closing in. But something, shifted. Jake's eyes darted around, looking for an exit. Anything. A faint glow caught his eye. A small crack in the wall. Light seeping through. The door, the one across the room, had been left slightly ajar. His heart raced. It was his only chance. "Run!" Lewis whispered again. His voice distant, urgent. Jake lurched forward. His legs unsteady. His mind hazy with panic. But the pull of the door was stronger now. He was almost there. A sharp, guttural laugh erupted from behind him. The woman. "Where do you think you're going?" Her voice mocking. Her footsteps, heavy and slow. As if she had all the time in the world. Jake reached for the door. His hand was trembling. Then, the lights flared back on. Blinding. Jake winced. But it wasn't the harsh light that made his stomach drop. It was the figure standing in the doorway. It wasn't the woman. It wasn't Lewis. It was him. Jake. Staring back at himself. The reflection was perfect. A mirror image. But the eyes were hollow. Empty. Jake's breath caught in his throat. He stumbled back, tripping over his own feet. The figures around him moved closer, closing in like predators. And then, the door slammed shut. The room went dark again. No light. No sound. Just the weight of their presence. Jake could feel them now. All around him. In his mind. In his soul. And in that moment, he realized the truth. There was never any escape. There never had been. He was already part of the game. The experiment. And it had already begun. Jake's breath caught in his throat. The darkness pressing in from every side. His heart pounded. Faster. Faster. He couldn't see. Couldn't think. The silence was deafening. Except for the faint echo of his own breath. His ragged gasps in the void. And then a voice. Low. Whispering. "Do you understand now, Jake?" The voice wasn't the woman's. It wasn't Lewis. It was his own. His own voice. Jake staggered backward. But there was nowhere to go. The walls closed in tighter. The shadows flickering and warping in ways that felt unnatural. "Don't fight it," the voice said. This time from all directions. Surrounding him. You're already a part of it. His head spun. The world tilting and shifting around him. The weight of the words pressed down like a 1,000-ton boulder. He tried to scream. But his throat was dry. No sound came. Then, in the blackness, he felt it, a touch. Cold. Unyielding. It was a hand. Slipping over his shoulder. Trailing down his arm. Sending a shock of ice through his veins. His body tensed. He couldn't breathe. The hand tightened its grip. He tried to break free. But it was no use. It was as if the darkness itself had him trapped. "Jake!" The voice again. Closer now, almost inside his skull. "Why do you think you're here? Why do you think you always felt like something was wrong?" He couldn't respond. Couldn't think straight. "Because you were chosen, Jake. You were never just a detective. You were the test subject. The final piece in their puzzle." A sharp, shrill laugh echoed in the darkness. Jake's knees buckled. He was falling. But there was no ground. Just the endless abyss. And then, a flash of light. His eyes stung as he tried to focus. The world around him began to take shape again. The figures, the room. Everything. Except. It was different. The walls, now translucent, flickered like an old film reel. The air was thick, almost gelatinous. And standing before him. It wasn't the woman. It wasn't Louis. It was another version of himself. The same face. The same eyes. But this one was smiling. A twisted, unnatural grin that made Jake's stomach lurch. "You think you're real?" The other Jake's voice was a mockery of his own. Jake's mind reeled. What was this? What was happening? The reflection of himself laughed again. A low, cruel sound. Asterisk, this is who you've always been, Jake. Asterisk. The experiment. The observer. The one who never escapes. The walls around them began to tremble. The air grew colder. Jake's reflection stepped forward. His smile widening. You were never supposed to leave, it whispered. Because you were never meant to be real. And just as the final piece of the puzzle clicked into place, Jake's world shattered. Jake's heart slammed against his ribs. The world around him seemed to warp and twist. The walls pulsed, as if they were breathing. He felt lightheaded, disoriented. The other Jake, the reflection, stepped closer. Each movement was unnervingly smooth. As if it were mimicking him, but wrong. Not quite right. You're nothing, the reflection whispered. Its voice was his, but laced with something darker. Something twisted. You've always been nothing, Jake. Just a cog in their machine. A puppet in a game you never understood. Jake's stomach lurched. He wanted to scream. But the words wouldn't come. The air felt too thin. The room too suffocating. No. Jake forced the word out. But it came out ragged, weak. The reflection chuckled. It was him, but it wasn't. Look at you. Trying to deny it. But it's too late now. His eyes, burned into him. A cold, empty abyss. You've been trapped in this loop for years. You were never meant to escape. Because you never left. Jake's mind spun. He couldn't breathe. This couldn't be real. It couldn't be happening. But as he stumbled backward, the world around him shifted again. The walls, once solid, melted away like smoke. The floor cracked and buckled, warping into nothingness. And then, a voice. Faint. Far away. A whisper that grew louder. Jake. It wasn't the reflection. It wasn't the woman. It was Louis. Jake's pulse quickened. His legs felt like rubber. But somehow, he found the strength to move. To run. But the darkness wasn't just behind him. It was inside him. He could feel it closing in. Swallowing him whole. Jake! Louis' voice rang out. Closer now. Urgent. He turned. But saw nothing. No one. The emptiness was unbearable. Jake, wake up. He stopped. The words cut through the fog. The darkness. Wake up? The floor beneath him trembled again. But this time, it didn't feel like the world collapsing. It felt like a shift. A crack in the illusion. And with that crack, the fog began to lift. The room, the shadows, the reflection of himself, they started to flicker. Like a broken television screen. And then, light. Bright. Blinding. Jake stumbled, falling to his knees. The world before him exploded in a flash. And suddenly, he was somewhere else. Somewhere familiar. The office. His office. The desk. The chair. The piles of files. Everything was in place. He wasn't in the room anymore. Not in the basement. Not in that twisted reality. Jake's breathing was shallow. His hands shaking. But he was free? Was it all a dream? The weight in his chest told him otherwise. The phone buzzed again. Jake hesitated. But he picked it up. The screen was cracked. The message appeared. It was from an unknown number. Wake up, Jake. You never left. A chill ran down his spine. And as the realization hit him, the office door creaked open. He wasn't alone. Not again. And as he turned, the woman from before stepped into the room. Her eyes glinted coldly. Welcome back, Jake. Jake's heart skipped a beat. The woman stood in the doorway. The same cold, predatory look on her face. Her eyes glinted with that same, unearthly gleam. It wasn't a dream. None of it had been. He wasn't free. He was still trapped. The office around him started to feel like a facade. An illusion. The walls seemed to pulse with an unnatural rhythm. Like the beating of a heart. The woman's smile twisted. It was too wide, too perfect. You thought you could escape? She asked softly. Her voice almost kind. Did you really think this was over? Jake backed away from her. His mind racing. His body still trembling. But his feet wouldn't move fast enough. The door was behind him. But the shadows were closing in. Filling the space like smoke. Suffocating him. No. His voice was hoarse. Barely a whisper. The woman stepped forward. She was unnervingly calm. Like she had all the time in the world. You've been chosen, Jake. It's always been you. You were the test. Jake's eyes flickered to the phone in his hand. The cracked screen still glowing faintly. Why? He gasped. Why me? She didn't answer right away. Instead, she stepped closer. Her presence suffocating. Then she spoke. Her voice soft, almost sympathetic. You were never meant to be anything more than this. A piece in their game. A vessel. A test subject. Jake's mind screamed. This couldn't be real. He couldn't be trapped here. I don't understand. He whispered. Her smile grew darker. You were always a part of it. You just didn't know. Jake turned quickly. Looking for an exit. Any exit. But the walls were no longer solid. They were shifting. Melting. Like liquid. He stumbled forward. His pulse racing. His thoughts a blur. The woman moved like a shadow. Slipping in and out of his vision. You'll never get out, Jake. Her voice was sharp now. Final. The door behind him slammed shut with a deafening bang. He turned. His breath catching in his throat. The office was no longer familiar. It was a maze. A twisted version of what he once knew. The air felt heavier. Thick with dread. You belong here, she said. Almost tenderly. Jake's legs buckled beneath him. His breath came in ragged gasps. The room was spinning again. No. No. The woman moved closer. And this time, she didn't stop. She reached out. Her cold fingers brushing his cheek. Don't worry, Jake. This is where you were always meant to be. And as her hand closed around his wrist, a surge of cold electricity shot through him. His body jerking involuntarily. The phone buzzed again. Jake's vision blurred. He reached out. Desperate to look at the screen. But it slipped from his fingers. It crashed to the floor. The screen shattered. And for a moment, complete darkness. Then, a new voice. It was familiar. Lewis? Jake croaked. A shadow emerged from the corner. Tall but shrouded. Jake, the voice said softly. And then, for the first time, Jake understood. There was no escape. No beginning. No end. The woman smiled again. And this time, it was more of a grin. You're not just part of the game, Jake, she whispered. Asterisk, you are the game, asterisk. The room dissolved into nothingness. And Jake realized. He was never meant to leave this place. The air around Jake thickened. His breath shallow and fast. The darkness seemed to press in from every direction. He couldn't move. Couldn't think. The voice of Lewis lingered in the air. Like a fading echo. Jake! It was soft. But there was something twisted in its tone. The woman stepped back, her eyes gleaming with triumph. Jake's chest tightened. The walls, they were closing in again. The space felt smaller, more suffocating. "You're nothing but a puppet, Jake," she said, her voice filled with cruel satisfaction. The room flickered, shifting once again. Jake's mind spun. He felt like he was losing control. Everything was slipping. His reality, his memories, his very sense of self. "Do you remember what happened?" The woman's voice cut through the fog. "Or has that been erased too?" Jake's head throbbed. A headache surged behind his eyes. Flashes of images. Pictures, faces. Places he'd never been. It was all merging. Overlapping. A tangled mess of thoughts. He tried to push them away. But the memories wouldn't let him go. The hallway, the photos, the figures. The endless chase for something he could never reach. But then, a moment of clarity. The alley. The people watching him. And the files. The files that never made sense. They were never meant to make sense. Jake gasped. A realization hit him like a ton of bricks. Asterisk, this has been the test all along. Asterisk. His mind reeled. The images, the puzzles. The game. It was never meant to be solved. He was never meant to solve it. His entire life. His work. His investigation. Was part of their twisted experiment. Jake dropped to his knees. The weight of the truth crashing down on him. "You're nothing but a tool," the woman's voice whispered. "It's always been this way." Jake's hands trembled. He wanted to scream. But there was no sound. "Wake up," she murmured. But this time, Jake wasn't sure if she was speaking to him. Or if she was speaking to herself. A cold wind howled through the room. And the shadows seemed to flicker and twist once again. The figures, the walls, everything around him felt like a dream. A nightmare he couldn't escape. He looked around. The room was breaking apart. The office, the woman, the figures, they were all fading. Like they never existed. The walls crumbled. The ground beneath him cracked open. And in the dark, Jake felt himself falling. He reached out, grabbing for something, anything. But there was nothing. Only the endless abyss. And then, a new voice. This time, it wasn't the woman. It wasn't Lewis. It was his own voice. But distant. Asterisk, Jake, it's not too late. Asterisk. The words echoed in his mind. But the meaning was lost to him. The darkness around him swirled. And in the blink of an eye, the ground vanished. And Jake fell. Further and further. Until all that remained was the void. The game had no end. And Jake? He was never meant to leave. Jake's body twisted in the void. Spinning faster. Further. Falling endlessly. He could feel time slip away. Sliding between his fingers like sand. Slipping out of his grasp. Never to return. The sensation was strange. He wasn't sure if he was falling. Or if the world around him was collapsing. Disintegrating. There were no walls, no floor, no ceiling. Just the suffocating nothingness. Closing in tighter with each passing second. His mind raced. But there were no thoughts. Just flashes of images. Blurred faces, places, names. It was like being trapped in an endless dream. No beginning. No end. Jake's pulse thudded in his ears. It was the only thing grounding him. The only real sensation left. "Wake up, Jake." That voice again. It was softer now. Almost pleading. Was it his own voice? No. It couldn't be. He reached out into the void. There was no solid ground beneath him. No object to hold on to. Just darkness. And the distant echo of his own heartbeat. But then, the world flickered again. A flash of light. Blinding and sharp. And suddenly, he was standing. Not falling anymore. He wasn't floating in the endless abyss. He was somewhere. A room. Familiar. The office. But twisted. The walls were cracked. The windows shattered. The air thick with dust and decay. It was like a nightmare made real. A place lost in time. The desk was overturned. Papers scattered across the floor like dead leaves. The chair was missing, as though it had been dragged away. And there, standing in the corner, was the woman. Her eyes met his. Cold. Empty. "Do you remember this place, Jake?" Her voice was a whisper. Soft and unsettling. Jake's heart thudded in his chest. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. Why are you doing this?" Jake's voice cracked, desperately searching for answers. The woman smiled. "A cruel, twisted thing. Because you were never supposed to leave," she said. "It's too late for that now." Jake's head spun. This wasn't his world. This wasn't reality. "Wake up, Jake," the voice whispered again. It was so close now. A sharp, urgent command. But Jake was beyond answers. Beyond comprehension. He was trapped. Trapped in a world that wasn't real. The room began to shake. The walls creaked. The floor beneath him groaned. As if the entire place was coming apart at the seams. The woman stepped closer. Her hand reached out toward him. And Jake felt an icy cold seeping into his bones. "You never left, Jake." Her lips curled into a grin. And it was then that Jake realized. He wasn't supposed to escape. He never had. The lights flickered once more. And then, everything went black. There was no falling. No room. No woman. Only the void. And Jake, still trapped, was left to wonder if he would ever wake up. Jake woke up. It wasn't gentle. There was no soft transition. No moment where his mind drifted back into reality. 1 second, the blackness had him. The next, light. He gasped, his lungs filling with air. But it wasn't the kind of air he expected. The smell wasn't fresh. Clean. It was sterile. He blinked rapidly, his eyes adjusting to the harsh fluorescent lights overhead. Where was he? He wasn't in the office anymore. Not in that maze. Not in the basement. He was in a room. White walls. Metal furniture. A cot in the corner. The floor was cold beneath him. Jake pushed himself up. His body stiff. Disoriented. He scanned the room quickly. A door. A window. Either of which opened. His heart began to race again. He couldn't remember how he got here. What was happening? But then, it all came flooding back. The woman. The darkness. The game. He was part of it. He always had been. But this place. This room. It felt different. This was real. Wasn't it? Jake stood. His legs unsteady. He walked toward the window. Outside. Nothing. Just a void. No sun. No sky. No ground. Just darkness. He turned sharply. The door. He tried to open it. But it wouldn't budge. Locked. Frantically, he pulled at the handle, banging on the door with both fists. "Let me out.